We're going to continue with our wonderful conference. This is our first plenary session entitled Contemporary Extensions of Du Bois Part 1. As I mentioned, we have three illustrious panelists: Marcus Brooks from Western Kentucky University, Shawntae Mitchum from the University of Southern California, and Phil Zuckerman from Pitzer College. You'll notice that their bios are in your program, such that we can maximize our time. I won't read their bios, and we're going to ask each person, so this will be kind of a slightly different dynamic. We're going to ask each of the speakers to speak between 10 to 12 minutes, either about themselves and their research. I know some persons have slides, and after each of them has an opportunity to speak for 10 to 12 minutes, then we'll open the floor for discussion amongst the three of them, as well as questions from the audience. And so that's the way that we will have our plenaries during this conference. And so at this time, I will turn it over. We will ask them to present and or discuss as they're listed in the program. So we'll start with Marcus Brooks.
Thank you, Sandra. And thank you for everybody for being here this morning, and thank you to Brown for organizing this important conference today. Let me just make sure. Okay, so my talk today is titled Double Consciousness and Colorblind Nationalism. And I end it with the question, resolving the two-ness of Black American identity. So this talk comes out of some theoretical work that I am developing based off of two empirical projects where I developed this concept of colorblind nationalism. So I leave this as a question because I'm going to argue today that colorblind nationalism does resolve a portion of double consciousness, but it is still a theoretical work in progress. So I look forward to our discussion and questions from the audience. Oh, sorry, hands off. All right, so Du Bois, in Conservation of Races, his 1897 piece, asked the question, am I American or am I a Negro? Can I be both, right? So what he's getting at is this attention that is what we understand as two-ness that he describes within double consciousness that Black Americans feel. He writes in Souls of Black Folks in 1903 about this two-ness, right? So being an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, right? So what he's getting at here is this kind of schism of identity. Like, how can you or can we be both Black and American? And even though that quote there came from Souls of Black Folks in 1903 and 1897 in Conservation of the Races, he does kind of offer us an answer to that question. He says that Black Americans are in fact Black and American. He says we are both, right? So he says we are Americans not only by birth and by citizenship, but by our political ideals, our language, and our religion. Right, and so he goes on to say it's our duty to conserve our physical powers, our intellectual endowments, our spiritual ideals. So what he is referencing at here is an expression of that two-ness, right? So, and what he is saying that Black Americans should and are both Black and American. He goes on to make the point in further in Conservation of Races that for Black Americans to be both Black and American, that their destiny should not be absorption into the white, or absorption by white Americans, right? So if we look at kind of historical assimilation of European Americans coming in, scholars will talk a lot about the erasure of ethnic traditional cultures, right? So Du Bois is kind of specifically, again, here referencing that Black Americans should maintain Black identity, Black institutions, Black schools, Black businesses, Black banks, these kind of things, these Black cultural, these communities as well. But the kind of issue then that I see arising here, and we see from more contemporary scholarship of kind of like national identity and nationhood, that to be American is to be, or to be unconditionally American is to be racialized as white, right? So there's a contemporary scholarship you see listed here, and some ethnographic and interview data from several scholars. And Micah E. Johnson, in his research, kind of comes to the conclusion, based off of his ethnographic and interview research, that the overwhelming majority of the participants in his research describe belonging to two often opposing nations, the American nation and the Black nation, right? So what this is getting at is that although Du Bois in Conservation Races says Black Americans are two and should be two, the question then arises, is this in fact reality, right? So Johnson asks this question or points to the American identity, he argues, contradicts the Black identity. So how can Black Americans be both Black and American? So that's the question that I kind of wrestle with in this empirical and theoretical work, is can Black Americans be both Black and American in a way that resolves these contradictions of double consciousness? All right, so the framework that I kind of am arguing that has potential for some, not all, for some Black Americans of this resolution of this tension is through colorblind nationalism, which again is a theoretical concept that I developed through two empirical research projects. I actually, earlier this week, found out I was awarded funding for a third. So I'll be starting that over this summer to further continue developing this concept, which I kind of bring out of the literature on new racism and colorblind racism. So I define colorblind nationalism as an ideology and a style of race talk that constructs solidarities between conservative white and Black Americans. So the first thing we see happening here is a construction of a group, of an in-group. In this case, it's conservative whites and Black Americans, right? So we have it's kind of shifting of solidarities here. By characterizing the groups as part of a national in-group with shared political, economic, and moral values, and who share opposition to an antagonistic, un-American outgroup, those on the political left, right? So we see here, again, starting the shifting of boundaries, of solidarities, but these boundaries are politicized, right? These boundaries are predicated on ideological and political beliefs. And finally, in which promises of Black success are rooted in colorblind ideals of liberalism and meritocracy and not anti-racist policy agendas, right? So that, the third part is kind of consistent with our understanding of kind of ideas of colorblindness and abstract liberalism, right? That what is offered here is freedom from the political left, the Democrats who offer Black Americans and in particular other Americans of color victimhood, right? Welfare, things like that, and instead offer a path to personal uplift through meritocratic values. And so what's important here in building this as a theory of nationalism is that, as Val Van points here, is that while we may traditionally understand nationalism as the outsiders representing those who are geographically, located outside of the nation, that in reality, the other to the nation can also exist within the nation, right? So I kind of conceptualize colorblind nationalism as a confluence of ethnic and civic nationalisms in the sense that, again, when we're talking about this reshifting or redrawing of boundaries to include Black and white conservative Americans, that this is predicated on a shared commitment to the preservation of civic and national identity, right, to Americanness. It also represents a style of neo-assimilationism. So I referenced earlier kind of the traditional ideas of assimilation that in many ways are focused on either the loss of cultures of origination or the domination or expropriation of those cultures. So Alba's concept of neo-assimilation very explicitly gives us a way to think about integration to what he calls an American mainstream that allows the group that would have seen as the minoritized group to maintain their culture and their unique identity. So in this case, this does not require Black Americans to give up their Black identity or their Black communities or their Black selves, right? And this is in some ways in contradiction to some of the research of Black conservatism, which at times will position Black conservatives as somehow as outsiders to Black community, whereas some of the work that I reference here kind of shows differently, right? So what is at stake here at the macro level are discussions about citizenship, about identity, about national identity, right? So, and finally, I kind of think about this in terms of assimilation as a style, or colorblind nationalism, assimilation as a style of predatory inclusion, because what is offered here, and again, this is a rhetorical style and ideology, what it offers is freedom from victimhood, from victimization, from the exploitive left, from the exploitive Democrats, and instead kind of offers old school neoliberal values of uplift. So in closing here, basically what I'm kind of argue is potentially what resolves the contradiction for those who adhere to and practice these styles of race talk and ideologies is that colorblind nationalism resolves the tensions of double consciousness by granting national identity to Black Americans who adopt patriarchal, heteronormative, meritocratic, and reactionary logics of whiteness. So I have 2 minutes left. So that's my talk on that. I did want to make one plug, if you would allow me to do so. W.E.B. Du Bois was no stranger to issues and problems of underfunding to certain programs within universities. My home department of sociology and criminology at Western Kentucky University in 2020, like many of our universities likely, instituted a W.E.B. Du Bois scholarship. Up to this day, this scholarship, not a single student has been awarded the scholarship because it has not yet been vested. So I am here asking for your generosity if you're able to do so, and you can see me after if you can't get that, and I have the QR code on my business card, to please make a gift if you can, because these scholarships go to Black and brown students within our department at Western Kentucky. So thank you.
All right. Sorry, I thought we were doing Q&A. So thank you, everyone, for being here today, and thank you for Dr. Earl Wright for inviting me to this space. I was thinking a lot about what I wanted to talk about today, and I changed it last minute because it's very, I think it would be very easy for me to come up here and talk about, my doctoral studies, the projects that I'm on, but I was really feeling this energy yesterday and just kind of thinking a lot about my voice and the impact that I can have for doctoral students and for people who are wanting to study Du Bois, who, like myself, have very much been one of the only in their various spaces. And so I'm going to share just a little bit of my personal story in the role of sociology in my journey. I do have, if you want to talk after about some of my research and my research interests, I'm happy to do that. But I feel like my assignment, my mission here today is to really speak to students and to speak to those of us who have always kind of felt like education has been a fighting for our voices, fighting for the research that we want to conduct, being unapologetic in the ways that we approach our research, which is something I definitely connect to Du Bois, not only in the work that he produced, but just in the way that he navigated his life, in the way that he was so reflective, and every piece of his writing was talking about his own positionality in everything and how he saw things to be and how that changed over time. And one of the pieces I felt extremely inspired by, not a specific piece, they're all very inspirational, and I think we hear a lot of those today, and so that's why I'm happy to just kind of talk about my own journey here, is really, he was very critical of our discipline. And I think that's something I very much relate to in a sense that I started out as a community college student, and so I'm a first person in my family to go to college. I very much still kind of don't feel like I belong in these spaces. I recently just advanced a candidacy in my department, and that's still very much like a thank you. Thank you. And that's still very much like something I'm trying to accept about myself as I professionalize, is I still very much see myself as someone who my mission is to bring forth Black liberation, to bring forth the importance of education and the role of students in advancing their own educational pursuits. And so that's where my mind is today, and so I'm just kind of going to kind of orient my talk around that. And so I think a lot of us can really relate, especially hearing, some of the stories that were shared here about this experience of surviving an anti-Black education system. And so there's a lot of literature that supports this out there. And again, I'm happy to talk about that when there's more time. But I'm really just kind of talking about my own experiences, not only in my doctoral program, but just as an academic, as a Black student who, if you were to talk to any of my high school teachers, would be very surprised that I'm here, that I'm in a doctoral program. I, by every measure, was tracked to go to prison. I was tracked to go, to not end up in an academic space. And so to be here is very much a privilege for me. But a lot of that it comes with this idea and this feeling that you have to continually fight. It has always been, I want to do this project, and I've read this specifically when it comes to Du Bois. Like many people here, I was not introduced to Du Bois in an academic classroom. I came across him in my own research and just trying to figure out, this connection between Blackness and education, because there was something that I knew was important. I knew education was the reason why, my focus and my drive to pursue higher education, regardless of my background, has really kept me focused on the idea that because I shouldn't be here, it's my job to make sure that others like me are positioned in ways that they can follow my path. And so at every step of my doctoral journey, and even before that, my undergraduate journey, has felt like a sense of survival. How am I going to make sure? I know that my goal is centering Black scholars, talking about the Black community, which was something, of course, Du Bois was very unapologetic in doing, especially at a time that he was doing it when there was a lot of, sociology and specifically, but also other disciplines were looking for reasons why the Black community was so deficient. Why are Black people poor? Well, it's because, it's a deficiency thing. It's their culture, right? And so to be able to insert into a space and talk about, liberation and talk about systems of oppression that were creating all of these different levels of oppression is really where I kind of see myself and see myself as a theorist pushing the discipline and continuing to be critical of our discipline, which is hard to do as a doctoral student. It's hard to do in a department where I don't have any Black sociologists or Du Boisian scholars to call to and to be like, hey, this is what I want to study and this is how I do it. And so I've been lucky enough to find spaces like the University of Cincinnati Black Social Reading Group, where I've been welcomed into spaces to have these conversations that are not only empowering but also validating. Because again, being in a department where no one studies what you study and no one has the perspective that you have is challenging, and it does really feel like a fight. And I think a lot of the times it can pull the focus away from the rigor, quote, quote, that you're supposed to do in your work. And so that's why I was okay today and not focusing my talk on my empirical studies. I'm getting ready to submit one of my research studies for publication, and so I'm happy to talk about that stuff. But I think it's just really important to talk about taking agency and taking control over the stuff and the things that you want to learn and what you want to get out of your own educational path. And so the role of education has always been important to me. And it's something that we see come up in Du Bois' work as well. So he definitely didn't create this delineation between scholarship and activism, and that is where I situate myself. And so for me, being in the classroom and being a student and looking at syllabi and questioning, why are we not talking about Du Bois? Or why are we only talking about double consciousness in the veil? Like, why are we keeping Du Bois in such a small box when we could be incorporating him into quantitative courses, into demography, into, the list goes on, as we've seen from scholars today. But why is it that and when we do learn about him, it's very minimal, right? Like, we're gonna read The Souls of Black Folk, Of Our Spiritual Strivings, maybe Dusk of Dawn, right? These very foundational pieces of Du Bois, but to me, it really just belittles the type of work that he has done for us. And I think Alden Morris really put it great. It's like, we are just kind of scratching the surface. We have a lot of work to do, and I have a lot of work to do in studying Du Bois, but one thing that I do know is that the way that he embodied sociology, the way that he just took control and agency over what he wanted to say and being unapologetic, and how he approached different conflicts around things, is really the way that I see myself as a scholar. And so, a lot of my process has been seeking out my own literature and research and scholars that reflect my own experiences. And so again, one of those fights of remaining in sociology when you're using your citations, or who are you pulling from? And I found a lot of my work situated in Black studies, or in interdisciplinary work. And so it's been a struggle and a fight for me in trying to, I don't feel like I need to get people to accept my work, but when you're in a doctoral program, that's kind of what you have to do, is you really do have to find your way while at the same time following along. You need to get through, right? We need to get out of these programs and get into our careers. But really, it's coming back full circle for me as I think about moving on to a faculty role and what I want to be able to teach my students. And I don't want them, students who look like me, to continue to have to fight for and defend their rights to use certain scholarship, to draw on only, for instance, experiences of the Black community, and then be told that it's not generalizable, which has been very much my experience in my work, is it's always, and I'm sure many of us can relate to this as well, is that it really has been about pushing back against institutional processes and expectations that don't align with the work that we're doing, which I really feel like Du Bois was doing in a lot of his work and a lot of his essays and papers, was this pushing back against things that have been said before and research that has been used to continually oppress people across various identities. And so just to briefly talk about my first publication was a co-authored piece with Jalea Joseph about the state of Black sociology, and we did a book review, a critical reflection on Joyce Ladner's Death the White Sociology. And really, we talked about this historical exclusion of Du Bois, but also other prominent Black scholars. And then this last piece of sociology's complicity in anti-Black racism and the impact that it has on Black graduate student training. And so the fact that we have to, as Black graduate students, come into spaces and feel like we're fighting, or feel like we are having to survive and really insert ourselves in spaces that weren't meant for us, this reflection really served as a call to the discipline into thinking about, how are we supporting our Black graduate students in the work that they're doing in a system that we know is inherently anti-Black? And so what types of support systems are we offering for Black graduate students? How are we continuing to rethink our curricula and dig deeper on issues and not just scratch the surface of scholars like Du Bois, like I feel like we have done in this discipline, is we are really just kind of hitting the surface of his work. And so I just wanted to take the time, I think my time is up. And so yeah, thank you all so much. I put a little QR code to because I did not submit my bibliography, I'm sorry, but to the State of the Black Sociology piece that Jalea and I wrote. And then, yeah, follow me on Twitter because I tweet a lot, so.
I'll do 11. Set my timer. Thank you so much, first of all, to Dr. Barnes. We had collaborated a few years ago, but never met in person, and I appreciate the greeting. I got a hug when I walked in the door. Really meant a lot. Thank you. Dr. Morris, I'm still kind of starstruck. It's funny. I know I'm 55 years old, but I still feel like a teenager sometimes. So it was so wonderful to hear Dr. Morris's lecture this morning. Every word was golden. You know, it's funny in academic circles. Sometimes you're looking for something to disagree with, or you're looking for a different angle. But sometimes someone just speaks, and you're just like, yep. Everything. So thank you both, and what an honor to be here. My name's Phil Zuckerman. I'm from the Claremont Colleges in Southern California, and see what I can do. I also came to Du Bois through community college. I was going to Santa Monica City College, and it was not through sociology. I took an African American history class with Dr. Jonathan Malanza, and that's when I was first introduced to Du Bois. And then I transferred to the University of Oregon. I think there's a fellow Duck here. And it was the same thing. Du Bois was never mentioned in a single class I ever took for the rest of my undergrad and my grad. But when I came to teach social theory at the Claremont Colleges, I went right back to Du Bois, and then the floodgates just opened up. My particular area of interest is sociology of religion. He is the founder of the sociology of religion in North America, bar none. And not just that, you know, the first criminologist in the United States, the first rural sociologist, urban sociologist, sociologist of education. It just goes on and on. You all know I don't need to belabor it, but I just want to echo some of the things that have been said. So I'm going to start with this great, it's like a jewel that I found for me in the archives at UMass. It's an essay that Du Bois was never published, but he typed it up. It wasn't just handwritten, so he was taking it seriously. 1895. And he writes how he had to teach Sunday school. And he writes about teaching Sunday school, and he writes about how this particular week they were talking about Elijah, the prophet of fire, the fine old story of Elijah and the prophets of Baal, a beautiful legend of biblical religious thought. And he was struggling with, how do I teach this to young minds? Why was he struggling? Because on the one hand, he thought that the story contained wonderful morals and ethics and teachings. But he also, in 1895, he saw this as a legend of a primitive people predicated on the miraculous, which he did not believe actually occurred. And so he struggles with, how do I teach this important lesson to my people, my community, but I don't really believe the details, the miracles that are in there. And he talks about how he doesn't do a very good job. And after the class, he says here, I didn't get a chance to teach the things that so seemed to me ought to be taught, the moral life, the question of lying and of stealing, the question of loving one's neighbor as oneself, the duty of sacrifice, the need of courtesy, the need of patience. All those things are extremely difficult to teach from the sort of lessons that are put down. And he says after class, he runs into the other instructor, the other woman teaching Sunday school. And he says to her, "What on earth did you do with this lesson?" I whispered to her. "Oh, I told them about the oratorio of Elijah," she said. I looked at her. "You dodged," I said. "Of course I did," she answered. This moment to me is remarkable. These two Sunday school teachers having to teach a biblical story to their students, both struggling with some of the supernatural elements, meeting afterwards in the hallway and saying, "How did you handle this?" "I dodged, me too." I think it's a pretty powerful moment, especially when we consider the role of religion and secularity in Black life. You know, as social scientists, we generally talk about the 3 B's, belief, behavior, and belonging when trying to study and measure religiosity. And what I find with Du Bois is how he navigates those 3. Clearly, we see the belonging. He was raised in the church. He gave back to the church as a young man. But then later in life, he stops going to church. And yet, he never stops recognizing and constantly drawing from that experience. So there's a level of belonging that always stays with Du Bois throughout his life. But then he becomes a quote-unquote free thinker when he moves to Berlin. And he praises the Soviet Union for not teaching children miraculous stories. So he struggled with belief in a way that I don't think people like to talk about too much. But it's there. It's very apparent. And in terms of the behaviors, on the one hand, he writes prayers for dark people, an unpublished, a big trove of prayer, and he writes a lot about religious stuff in his early days, and then later he seems to go away from that. So I like to see Du Bois as a bit of a prism for certain aspects of African American religiosity and secularity. What am I talking about? Well, I'm just going to share some recent data here. In terms of church attendance by race, of African Americans were asked, how often do you attend church, and were given certain options, 30% today now say never or seldom. That's 30% of African Americans. And there's this notion that, oh, African Americans are so religious, they're the most religious, but we see that there's currents of free thought going back to the 1890s. Check this one out. In 2008, when African Americans were asked, what is your religion? And they were given lots of options, and one of the options was none. Not like a nun, singing from The Sound of Music, but like N-O-N-E, none of the above. In 2008, 19.5% of African Americans said none when asked their religion. By 2020, that was at 35%. That's quite a strong growth, and it's actually the largest growth of any racial or ethnic group in terms of none. And what's interesting, finally, is when you look at just Gen Z by race, in this survey include white, black, Hispanic, Asian, all others. The category that had the largest percentage of people saying, I'm nothing in particular, are you Christian, are you Catholic, are you Muslim, whatever, 42% African Americans is the largest chunk of those racial categories to say nothing in particular. So as I study religiosity and this growing wave of secularity, I can't help but look back on Du Bois constantly. And Christopher Cameron's doing a lot of great work on this as well. But I just wanted to sort of share a little bit of that with you. And then I want to take the last few minutes to directly talk to some of the students here, grad students, undergrads. So much of academia is cultural. You get told, oh, you got to do this requirement, you got to take this class, and you got to take this exam. You get this sort of playbook, but so much of academia is informal. It's the norms of academia. It's the values of academia. And if you're first gen, or you are in a marginalized or outsider status, it's almost like you're in a foreign country and you don't want to offend somebody, you don't know the norms, is it appropriate to talk to a professor this way? Is it appropriate to attend this seminar in this way? Is it appropriate? So I was trying to think, what can I say? And the only thing I could get was, email me. Let me help you. I am here. You just send me that email. You know what? I was at that conference at Brown. My name is so-and-so. I'm in grad school. I'm dealing with an issue with my professor, and I don't know how to navigate it. I'm dealing with an issue with my committee. I don't know how to navigate it. And we'll Zoom, and I will be so happy to at least give you my 2 cents from my positionality and my experience through academia, because so much of your success depends not just on publishing this and passing that exam, but also the connections you make and the ways you navigate that culture. So I just want to end on that note. Let's see how I did. 2 minutes left. I'll end a little bit early. Thank you. Wait, I think I did have something else. I just had to say, this is my asterisk. So what Professor Barnes and I did, we wrote the introduction to the 100th anniversary of the publication of the Negro Church, the first sociological study ever conducted on religious life in the United States. Extremely empirical, extremely rigorous. It was published in 1903. Does anybody know what other book by Du Bois was published in 1903? Can you imagine? The same year he publishes one of the most important books in American history, he's also publishing this sociological study, the Negro Church. This just speaks, I guess, I just want to echo what Professor Morris was talking about, the profound productivity of this giant of American sociology, social science, and intellectual life. Thank you for having me. Good to talk with you.
Thank each of you for your comments. As I mentioned, this particular interaction will be a little bit different. We really want to ask you, each of you, to engage each other, and then if persons have questions, please come down to the microphones as usual. I'd like to start the question process for each of you. 2 questions. First is, it's real clear, at least to me, that for Du Bois, what he was doing or endeavoring to do was not just an academic exercise, meaning not just publishing for the sake of publishing. We talked about, and everyone talked about how he was a scholar activist. I'd like each of you to talk about Du Bois as praxis in your mind, whether it be from religion, whether it be from other topics. How do you imagine, or how do you discuss or think about Du Bois as praxis? The second question is coming from Shawntae's comment. First, I do want to say you're here for a reason, and you should be here. And I just want you to always remember that in your spirit. I'd like you all to talk about, your comment brought up concepts like miracles, because for some people, for some of us here, our being here is a miracle, whether we want to kind of frame it in that way or not. If you could talk about issues of entitlement and privilege and having to fight, which is kind of part of Du Bois's legacy as well. So what did entitlement, what do you think entitlement meant for him, and how do you, because we're extending Du Bois, how can we extend Du Bois and think about issues of entitlement and privilege and fighting to do this kind of work today? Those are my 2 questions to start our conversation.
Do we just hop in here? Okay. Do we just each go?
Yes, exactly.
Oh,
Just discuss. Would you all like me to sit up here, or?
Doesn't matter.
No, just because I want you all to feel really comfortable just having a conversation. Cool. Yes.
All right, well, I'll start it out with this first question about Du Bois as praxis. The way that I see myself using Du Bois is not only confined to the type of work that he does, like his actual concepts and theoretical contributions, but it's really this, it is very much that praxis. So it's like, when you're walking into a conference or even a classroom, and I know for me, I'm always the one to challenge the professor. I mean, respectfully, but always the one to say, we're talking about, immigration or assimilation concepts, and we're not bringing in, these pieces and Du Bois's pieces. And it's, not only Du Bois, but we can extend that to lots of Black scholars who are marginalized, or their work has been trampled over, stepped over, forgotten. And so I think Du Bois as praxis, when it comes to specifically my focus in education, I think about a lot of that fighting, and of that, at what point do we not have to fight to have these conversations happen organically in the classroom, led by the professor? Because oftentimes what I've found in my own experiences is that it's the graduate students, or even when I was an undergrad, who have to bring things up in the classroom in order to insert where they see their work aligned. And so I do think it's very much of this pushback against, general hegemonic constructions of what constitutes scholarship, where we are very much looking at, who's cited the most, how much have they published, how much voice do they have, how much rigor is their work, and I don't think that is what we are told is the measure of success. But I think what happens is then we forget about people like Du Bois, who was doing work that at the time didn't get as much attention, or didn't get citations, or whatever. And so because academia is constructed in such a way that rigor, and which his work is rigorous, if you've read his work, is very rigorous. It takes multiple readings sometimes for me to really understand. But just it hasn't, our thoughts of rigor have not been constructed around the type of work that he does, or did. And so I think that that's really a part of Du Bois's praxis, is how are we pushing back against these ideas of what's considered to be academic, these essays he's produced, and the written works and the archival works, that's, as a graduate student being trained, that's not the places that we're taught to go. We're taught to go to the libraries and the databases, and look at how many citations, or impact factors on journals, and all of these measures that end up missing the opportunity to focus on people like Du Bois because he was excluded and because there was this intentionality in not including his work in this mainstream, I would argue, white sociology. And so,
Yeah, so thank you for the question, Sandra. So the first thing I think that comes to mind when I think of Du Bois as praxis is a question that I think of, and this is, of course, a Du Boisian conference, so of course we're all going to dig deep into Du Bois's published and unpublished works, and it's important that we do so, but I think an important takeaway for me from Du Bois was the fact that while we tend to speak about Du Bois as an individual scholar, and rightly so in many ways, right? But I think also to some of the discussion from Alden earlier and some things that were brought up earlier, part of that is then also part of the problem, right? That we can see Du Bois as this one exceptional Black man who did great stuff, and we could just throw him on the syllabus. I like this. Somebody said earlier that he's an add-on. I wrote that. I really like that. I thought that was an interesting way to put it. But so I think about then in terms of like the communities that Du Bois worked with, especially I'm thinking about in his early career at the Atlanta Sociological Laboratory, and to kind of Shawntae's point, bringing up kind of like different sources of knowledge, the way he utilized people who were not formally trained in academia, so community members relying on knowledges from people in communities, not necessarily knowledges from people who just from the university, right? So you see this validation of knowledge, right? So I also think about it in terms then thinking of Du Bois's broader network of folks that he worked with, inspired and was inspired by. I think particularly about his former student turned colleague turned lifelong friend, although most history books would tell you differently, it's not true. Augustus Granville Deal, who was a student of his at Atlanta University, and once Du Bois went to New York to help found the NAACP, took over his role as department chair. And I'll just make a long story short, Deal eventually moved to New York, worked at the Crisis with Du Bois, and for many reasons, ended up no longer working at the Crisis. But what he did after that fact was a sociological praxis, what I call kind of Black public sociology, where he took the knowledge that he gained studying sociology, working as a sociologist, working as an academic, and took the lessons learned. So if you look at the Atlanta sociological publications, there's always this section at the end where it says, well, what do we do now, right? And this is kind of one of those things that we see all the time now. It's like, oh, it's implications, right? But at the time was kind of a novel thing to include. And Augustus Granville Deal took those Atlanta sociological studies and implemented them in the form of creating a community center in downtown Harlem, right? Called Dill's Personal Service Shop, where he offered services to his community, right? So we're talking about 1920s, 1930s, where a lot of people didn't have access to phones or a permanent address, so he would let them use his phone and address to apply for jobs and to get mail. He held community events to foster that sense of community and to uplift and to offer material uplift to people in the community. And that's just one of the things. He also worked creating the Brownies book, which was dedicated to what Du Bois called a style of positive propaganda, of putting out into the environment, into the world, positive images of specifically for Black and brown, Black girls and boys. So I see that as an example of the praxis. And the thing that I want to leave off and note on there is that the praxis does not have to necessarily look a certain way. And I think that's why both Shawntae and Phil's words are well taken, right? That the part of the problem sometimes is that we get into this academia system that says we have to publish this way, we have to write this way, we have to publish in this journal. That's not sociology, that's not research, that's not rigorous. And that's not necessarily true, because who defines what the field is? We do. We are the ones who are working in the field. We're the one training up students working in the field. So we also can redefine it. And I think this conference is a great way to do that. But I'll just leave it there.
Thank you. I guess the things that came to my mind were sort of the nature of sociology, first of all. You know, some of my colleagues, I don't know this because I don't know much about chemistry, but I think the ones that do chemistry, I think they can kind of come to work and look at isotopes or zinc, or I don't know what chemists look at, and teach classes on that and go home. And it's possible to sort of, if they want, shut out what's going on in the world. I don't know. But in sociology, you can't really do that, because the nature of sociology is to talk about the contemporary world and what's going on, and inequality, and oppression, and justice, and injustice, and race, and class, and gender, and sexual orientation. I mean, this is what we're doing. And so it's almost like, how can you not be torn between or drawn to take what you're doing academically and at least have it applied to, or apply it yourself to the what you're studying, the problems you're addressing. So I think there's a natural tendency for sociologists to straddle that activist, academic line, but I think Du Bois did it better than anybody. I don't know if anybody's ever matched what he was able to do in bridging his academic and activist life. I mean, not just founding the Niagara Movement and then NAACP, but what he did for the Scottsboro Boys, what he did for the Pan-African Congress, as Dr. Morse talked about a World Peace Conference. I mean, just an endless life, and constantly publishing, constantly writing. So I see there's something there about the discipline. But then I also have to say there's something about the man, the person, the tenacity. My life couldn't be any different than Du Bois's, but when I read about his life and I listen to his words, so many things stand out for me in terms of just the perseverance and the tenacity that he exhibited. And dare I say, the poise. I mean, when he graduates from Harvard, having written the first great dissertation on the slave trade ever published in this country, he is told by the university in Philadelphia, well, first of all, no Ivy League school will take him, right? In Philadelphia, they take him and they say, well, you can have an office and we'll hire you for a year, but you can't teach any classes. And how that did not dispirit, I mean, I'm sure it felt terrible, but he persevered and he continues. And it's just every step of the way he faced things like that. When he was in grad school in Berlin, he has to listen to lectures of taxonomists who show different skeletons of different primates and different, and here's this orangutan skeleton, and here's this chimpanzee skeleton, and this is a skeleton of a black person, and this is a skeleton of, when he writes a litany in Atlanta, and he's taking an article to the newspaper to be published, and he sees the knees of a lynched man on sale at a butcher shop. I mean, how do you keep walking after that? How do you keep going and going and going? And boy, did he. So I don't know how, but what it does for me personally is it just gives me a level of humility. So every time I feel like I'm having a bad day at work, or I'm like, are you kidding? Are you kidding? And I just try to kind of compare myself to the little I know of Du Bois and what he faced, and I think, I've got, you got to be kidding me. So I think having that sense of one's own positionality, and I'll just end by saying, to this day, when I walk into a classroom, I guess I'm kind of what most students expect to see. I got gray hair, I'm white, I'm male, I'm in my 50s, I am what they think a professor is. And I don't bury that burden that double burden. There's the initial burden of just, oh, am I going to do good as a scholar? Am I going to do well but I don't stop and have to think, how is this going to reflect me as my people and Du Bois was just having to face that constantly. And and yes, we don't want to make him a saint, but what an amazing man and what an inspiration. So thank you. What was the second one?
Miracle.
Because I know there was the praxis and the...
You asked about issues of entitlement and privilege
Oh.
and navigating that, because we know that was a challenge. You just shared some of the challenges that, to me, really go to, who is entitled to teach where, and who is entitled to publish where. And so you all have been sharing that, and so I wanted to kind of ask you to extend that relative to talking about not just Du Bois's challenges, but talking a bit more about any insights that you would share with with folks here. Does that make sense?
I hope so, because I have a thought, and I don't know if it's... I just think the way that in thinking about my own personal background, my own personal journey is like, yes, I am not someone who people thought would ever make it to this level. But now that I am here, I think that it is my mission and it's my assignment, and the stakes are high when it comes to, focusing on Black liberation and oppression and, human liberation when we're thinking about, globally and the things that Du Bois is focused on. And so when you're saying like entitlement and privilege and things like that, my first thought is like, yes, there are many ways that I can talk about what, the oppression that I experienced as a Black woman, as a mother, as a graduate student. But I also think of myself relative to people I graduated high school with, who many of them ended up in prison. And some of them, unfortunately, passed for gang affiliations and things like that. And so I very much think about my position and my role, and I carry that with me everywhere I go and every talk that I do. And every space that I engage is that I could be very fearful to say some of the things that I say in spaces, especially challenging a discipline that, oftentimes looks at the work that I do as like, qualitative and like, oh, you're only talking to Black people and, oh, it's not generalizable. But I think what really keeps me centered and what keeps me focused is like, I feel like I'm on a mission, right? Like there is a goal, there is, I'm here for a reason. I made it this far for a reason. And so how do I then, the term of Sankofa, the idea of Sankofa is like, how do I then reach back, and bring people with me, the idea of lift as you climb. And so I do have a sense of privilege of being in this space and being able to talk and being able to share my experiences. And so that really inspires a lot of the conversations I do give. I can go the academic route and talk about, my research, and I love to do it, and I will nerd out on it all day. But oftentimes when I get this feeling of like, Shawntae, maybe someone needs to hear your story, or like maybe someone needs to hear, how you've got yourself to this place, or all the support that you've had along the way. And so that's kind of what came to mind is oftentimes we do focus on, being the only in the classroom. Well, it's like, well, at least I made it to the classroom. At least I'm able to sit on this stage and share the fact that I should not be here, and yet I've, pushed myself and knocked down doors to be in a space like this, in hopes that in the future this room is full and it is diverse, and it is all of the things that we hope that the discipline will move towards in recognizing the importance of scholars like Du Bois.
Yeah. So when I think about this idea of entitlement, I reflect back on some of the advice that I got about, we've talked a lot about like mentorship and kind of learning from others as we go through in our careers. But I think about the advice that I got when I was in grad school and as I was preparing and when I was on the job market. Specifically advice about kind of once you get the job, like what do you do? How do you keep the job? How do you get tenure? And of course, it was a lot of the the regular stuff: do service, teach, publish, all of that. But one of the things in particular that kind of stuck with me, and this is not just advice that I received, but advice that kind of a general discourse that I see that I'm sure a lot of you have heard too, is the idea of when you get your job, your pre-tenure, keep your head down, do your work. And then if you want to shake tables, if you want to cause problems, if you want to speak up, wait until after you have tenure to do that. So I am 2 years into my first academic job. I guess I'm a new-ish professor, PhD in the field, but I was an older student. But as I kind of got my first job and got my first year under my belt and went into my second year as an assistant professor, and thinking about those experiences in terms of entitlement, kind of my perspective has shifted a little bit from the kind of the standard boilerplate advice that I've gotten and that I've seen other people get about just keeping your head down and being quiet. And I think the idea of entitlement actually works really well for that, because in many ways, and I'd say for myself at my institution, and I think a lot of us probably feel this way, or if not, we should feel this way, is that I think we think of entitlement as kind of like a bad thing, right? That it's somehow that to have entitlement is to have certain types of privileges, right? But for me, I feel entitled to be where I am, right? I am entitled to be there. I think that I should not have to prostrate myself to my tenure committee or to my department chair, to my dean, and, oh, thank you for having me be here, and just, keep my mouth shut and not speak up when I feel like that there's something that I need to speak up about within the grounds of my university. But for me, a lot of that does come from entitlement, right? If not just the fact that I know that I have earned my spot there through the great work and scholarship that I've done, am doing, and will do, but also by the fact that in many ways, and in a lot of ways physically, my ancestors and a lot of our ancestors built those physical buildings, built those physical grounds. So if we are not entitled to be in the places that we physically built, where are we entitled to be? So, yeah. So, yeah, that's just how I think about that idea of entitlement. And I think kind of jumping off a lot of the discussions earlier, because I know for a lot of students, graduate students, early career scholars, like, we're struggling, and a lot of graduate students are struggling, especially those of you who want to do this type of work and this type of scholarship. But I'd say, again, going back to my earlier answer as well, and about Du Bois's community, part of Du Boisian sociology is that community. And I'll say, for me, having my community of Du Boisian sociologists guide me and be there to support me and to answer the phone after I've had a really bad encounter with a committee at the department or the whatever, those are the things that help keep me going. So all that to say that, one, we should feel entitled to be in these places. These places are lucky to have us. And we should build Du Boisian-like communities to help us navigate those institutions.
Thank you for sharing. Oh, I guess I'll just, a couple things. Thank you so much. But I was thinking about, you go to grad school, everybody's talked about the Marx Weber Durkheim, but my experience was you go to grad school and you're taught, well, this is what it is. So then when you get your teaching job, what do you know? You know what you were exposed to in grad school. So how does innovation ever come about? It just seems to replicate itself. So how has Du Bois been making these inroads? And it's pretty obvious that it's because of scholars of color. I don't know other, that's the, I'm trying to think. So the more we have scholars of color at the table, that is the promise or the aspiration of having a diverse group at the table, so that these other voices and other experiences are brought to the fore. So and then I'm going to say this. I don't know if anybody's experienced this. I don't know if this is like a white dinner party thing, but I'm going to say it anyway. So, and please tell me. Thank you. So, when I'm like at a white dinner party, and people ask me what I'm studying or what I'm working on or what I'm teaching, and I say Du Bois, they look at each other and they say, he doesn't even know how to say it right. It's Dubois. I don't know if you get, and so you already feel this like, oh, I'm so ignorant, like I don't even know how to say Dubois, and you just, every time. So this has been for 25 years, it's so annoying, and I almost have these like pet ways of dealing with it, like, oh, I'm really interested in W.E.B. Du Bois, and yes, that is how he spelled it, and he says it twice in both of his autobiographies, and you can call the Du Bois Center at Harvard if you would like confirmation of that, but you can't really say that. So I don't know if anybody else struggles with that, but there's something there about, to me, it brings up something about class. It brings up assumed ignorance. It brings up a lack of refinement. Like, you say Du Bois, and it's just, I don't know. To me, it always brings up these issues. And African Americans know Du Bois. But when you're around white people and you say Du Bois, they look at you like you don't know what you're talking about. And I'm white, so I don't even know what that must be like if you're a person of color and you say Du Bois. So I just am throwing that out there. Hope I'm not the only one.
I don't go to white dinner.
Okay. Be prepared.
I think we're on Q&A. What?
Hello. Thank you all so much for this panel. Very, very interesting and informative. My question is for Phil. My name is Dr. Shawntae Allen. I am a first-year assistant professor at Dartmouth College in the departments of sociology and African American studies, and my research is situated at the intersection of race, religion, and social movements. Wow. So first wanted to just shout out you and Dr. Barnes, who was on my dissertation committee for this edition of the Negro Church, which was very formative to my research. From the comp stage on, I started to learn more about Du Bois's role in religion when I had the opportunity to take Du Boisian sociology in my first year of graduate school, taught by Dr. Earl Wright, my mentor. And so that book was really, really formative. So I kind of have two questions. So again, my research is on Black Christian millennials and how they're making sense of race and faith and politics within the Black Lives Matter context. So the statistics that you provided were really interesting, and that's a lot of the narrative of social religion, which hasn't been particularly helpful for me as I actually study people who identify as Christian and actively go to church. But I have been fantasizing about theorizing this idea of culturally Christian and this idea of, in other monotheistic Abrahamic religions, there's a concept or a name or a label to be affiliated with the religious tradition without adhering to it in that way. And we don't really have that in the Black Protestant Christian tradition. So I wanted to invite you to talk a little bit about how possibly Du Bois kind of demonstrates this idea of being a culturally Black Christian, or at least recognizing the significance of the institutional Black church without necessarily adhering to the faith. So not the believing part, but more of the belonging and behaving. Not so much of the behaving and believing part, but more of the belonging and recognizing that. Because it's also really interesting, being a person who does this research in religion, I constantly am getting messages from other scholars like, hey, I'm doing this Black sociology work, and religion keeps coming up. Do you want to co-author a paper with me? Because they don't really know anyone else doing this work. So there's this interesting thing where the tradition of Black Christianity is really strong, but we also know that these disaffiliation rates are increasing. And so, how do we make sense of that? And then also, even amongst my participants that I worked with in my study who actively engage with the church, there's still this tension, this kind of disappointment with the current state of the institutional Black church. And so there's this interesting thing that happens where they say, oh, I'm not going, I'm not giving my money because it's not representing me politically. But then when a moment pops up in the culture and in the community, where's the church at? So it's like this really interesting tension where it's like, I'm not gonna support it, I'm not gonna give my money to it, but when something happens, we still look back to it the same way that our ancestors did. So anyways, I invite you to provide any comments on all that.
Wow, thank you for sharing. And good to know you're there, and I wish you well at Dartmouth, and thank you so much for your kind words. So much. We need to sit and just have coffee, and I'm glad you're doing the work you're doing. I guess the first thing I thought of was an essay Du Bois wrote, I believe in 1895, called The Problem of Amusement. And he talks about how, well, young black people, young black men and women, they're not allowed to go to the amusement park. They're not allowed to go to the zoo. They're not allowed to go to the movie theater. They're not allowed to, or there wasn't movies then, the theater, and they're not, they're not allowed to go to sport event, like all the things that young people, to do this dance or this whatever. And he says, so where can black people go? Not just young people, but and he says, well, it's the church. And he talks about the church as not just a place of theology or divine interaction, but as a political center, a cultural center, and so on and so forth. I don't need to tell you this, but I think he was keenly aware of what you call that cultural Christianity. But of course, there's a distinct black cultural Christianity that is its own entity, and it's so unique. And even Du Bois writes about how even during times of slavery, and it varied by county, right? But the religious space was really the only space. Again, there was varying degrees. In some counties, you had to have 2 white people present at any church gathering, or you had to have a white minister, or it depended. But in some cases, you didn't. And that was the only space that African Americans could call their own. And that was the only position for, at that time, a man, the black preacher, to have some sense of autonomy and agency in their own life. And it was limited, and it was, so that's always been at the root. So what I would say to you is, with those statistics I was sharing, like, what I see is absolutely there's a sense of, this is more than just Bible stories. This is more than just, this is my people, my community. And I think the ability to be able to not share the beliefs all the way down the line, but still get the best of what you want out of it, whether it's ritual, whether it's community, whether it's charity, whether it's comfort and support. I think that's so important, and that we mustn't look at religion as an either or. Either you believe X, Y, and Z, or you're out. And I will add, I didn't mention in my statistics, but even though there's that large chunk of African Americans that say they're nothing in particular, when asked specifically, are you an atheist? African Americans come in at the lowest compared to other racial or ethnic groups. And I just think that's relevant and important. So those are some of my thoughts.
Thank you all. Zawadi Rexahidian, I'm in the sociology department at SUNY Albany. Going up for tenure in the fall, so send your good vibes. So I just wanted to ask 2 quick questions. So one, the soon-to-be Dr. Mitchum, you made me think about citation politics. And how do we address the ignoring certain scholars in the literature? I'm finding this commonly actually around theoretical or methodological ideas that Black and brown scholars have, that those are not given credit. They may be given credit for their substantive contributions around, for example, I do work on gentrification, so Black gentrification, but not the theoretical ideas they're introducing to study gentrification in that space. So I'm curious about your thoughts about what we should all be doing about citation politics. And I asked the panel to contribute to that as well. And I wanted to follow up also on something that Dr. Zuckerman said, which is how Du Bois has done work that's relevant to all of these different subfields of sociology. And yet, we talk about him solely, or almost solely, in the race space, and maybe also in urban sociology. So how can we encourage the use of Du Bois and the contributions he's made in all of these different subfields in more broadly, rather than it being like, oh, that's race work?
Thank you.
I can go. So I heard you mention about citation politics, and that's something I think a lot about. I'm very intentional in when I'm getting ready to submit one of my first empirical publications, and I was very much thinking a lot about this idea of citation politics and the type of training that we receive as graduate students to, again, I mentioned this earlier, but I think it's worth repeating, of, who cited the most and who, got it in the most highest impact journal and all of these things. And I'm not discounting, maybe just a little bit discounting, but not fully discounting those measures. But I also think a lot about like who's excluded from those measures and why are they excluded? They're not excluded because they don't have, the empirical knowledge or the background to speak on these things. They're excluded by nature of who they are. And so I think it's tough being a graduate student and wanting to publish your work, but also recognizing that wanting to publish your work using scholars who maybe their work doesn't get as much attention is not really like as accepted in when you're trying to get things into these big journals. I think we are becoming more open as a discipline. I think the more that we have these conversations, but in reality, and this was something that kind of came up in my department of like, at what point do we like acknowledge that yes, these people have said these white scholars have said these things for years, but we know that Black folks have been saying them for even longer sometimes. And so at what point do we stop citing those people? At what point do we say, okay, yes, these are important in some aspect, but at what point do we start transitioning into, we're recognizing, for instance, Du Bois has been excluded. And so how are we going to like put that into practice as a discipline and continually make sure that we are citing Du Bois across the line, across all of these subfields? So like the other kind of question was about being siloed into his focus on race only. And I think that very much has to do with him being a Black man. It's like it is assumed that Black people talk about race. It is assumed that Black people who do sociology are going to talk about race or bring up race. And I think that's the easy thing for the discipline to do. I think the harder thing for the discipline to do is to put him in a quantitative class and build a class around the way that he used statistics and his graphs and all of those beautiful things that I myself am still trying to love. But I think that's the hard part. And I think a lot of the times when it comes to, citations is we take the easy way out. We take this person has been talked about so much, and so people have already been thinking about this, and I can refer to all of these reviews, and I can refer to all of these, cross-references that help me think. But if we choose the ones that maybe are not getting as much attention, we have to do more of the thinking. We have to do more of the groundwork to think about how it applies broadly, because that many people are not focused on it. And so I think that's the harder part. And that is definitely a mission of mine. But I will say it's a struggle. I'm not someone who is heavily published. I hope to be one day, and I hope to bring all of those people with me, and I'm very conscious in who I'm citing. So thank you.
I'll just add one thing to that, going back to our earlier question. I think kind of the things that Shawntae was talking about, and doing the work of kind of dismantling this kind of existing citation politics is praxis, right? The idea of impact, it's a room full of sociologists, impact factors are a social construct. We can change the metrics by which we judge the impactfulness of journals. So as we become part of T&P committees and department chairs and all these different things, then we are in positions to say, hey, maybe this journal over here has not been traditionally recognized, but that doesn't mean that the literature being published here, the research being published here, isn't any less impactful just because it doesn't hit some arbitrary metric that has been decided by folks 100 years ago or 80 or whenever it was.
I mean, I could comment, but I know there's people that still want to ask questions. So, I was just going to say, Max Weber writes this bizarre book about these few Protestants and Catholics in the 15th century in Belgium, Netherlands, and Germany, and I don't think anybody said, how is this generalizable? How is this not a niche? Come on, are you kidding me? Right. And I'll just say that, to that question of, globalization's huge in every discipline. Du Bois is the first global thinker. He's way ahead of the curve, right? And everybody's talking about intersectionality. As Dr. Moore said, he was already there. Everybody's talking about colonialism, imperialism. There's Du Bois. So yes, he's the first great theorist and social theorist of race, but he's also so much more than that. And even if he's talking about his particular experiences, they're still generalizable. We're all human beings. We all experience different degrees of these things. Some more than others, obviously, but I think if you're only reading Du Bois for that one particular lens, there's a lack of imagination there and human empathy, I guess.
Okay. My question is for Professor Brooks. I also study double consciousness, so I really enjoyed your talk. And I had a question about cultural nationalism, which sounds like these people are washing their Negro souls in white Americanism. Do you view this as like some kind of false consciousness, or are these people making like calculated decisions to, I guess, ignore racism? I guess the word resolve, the tune is kind of, like I kind of hung up on the word resolve. Are they really resolving it, or are they just, I don't know, just ignoring reality, ignoring the veil or whatever? So that's all I have for you.
Yeah, no, thank you for the question, because like I said, this is still I'm working on. I would say my first kind of gut response to this question of false consciousness would be, just in a nutshell, I'd say, and we can talk about it more, that my problem with it is that it somehow suggests that people do not have agency, and they do not have well thought out reasons for doing the things that they do and believing the things that they believe. So I do think that I don't want to say that there is no false consciousness. I don't want to use false consciousness to deny people the agency of their beliefs. And just for time, I'll leave it there.
One more?
First of all, thank you for this amazing talk. I'm quite new to the world of Du Bois. I hadn't even heard of him until last year. So it's been amazing hearing how expansive his work is and how applicable it is. My question is to all three of you. It's not to anyone in particular, but it is a little inspired by what Shawntae had to say. So I was thinking about Dr. Morris's book, The Scholar Denied, and he talks quite a bit about Du Bois and the Atlanta School and how he inspired so many students and researchers to follow in his footsteps and continue his work, and he was described as a profound influence on them. And so I was wondering if you can comment on what we can learn from him in fostering academic communities, particularly for students who may be new to the world of academia or are still finding their footing in research.
I feel like I'm always the one I'll go. The first thing that comes to mind, and it's something that I've had to do, is finding the spaces that allow you to have the conversations and do the readings. Something I've had to accept is oftentimes I'm not going to get the substance that I want in the classroom, because a lot of it, unfortunately, is dependent on the faculty and how equipped they are to really dive deep into Du Bois's work. And from my experience, I haven't had a faculty member who has had that deep study of Du Bois, and so I've had to go to outside of my department, outside of my school even, to find these conversations and to be with people who I can have critical conversations about. And so I think also something that kind of quickly came to mind is that he was very open to learning from students and learning from the community. And so, while faculty in the room are like, you hold the power, you have the privilege according to the institution, students also are producers of knowledge as well.
Cosign.
Me too. Thank you.